Hey everyone! Tonight we're delving into the smoky, grimy, and surprisingly perilous realm of medieval taverns. These fabled meeting places where ale flowed ceaselessly, strangers became allies or adversaries, and the demarcation between order and pandemonium was as fine as diluted beer. But dismiss all preconceived notions gleaned from fantasy films and video games. The authentic medieval tavern was a setting where mere survival transcended avoiding food poisoning. So before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content I provide. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see our global audience. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's gently embark on tonight's journey together. Envision this. You're navigating the muddy thoroughfares of 14th century London, your boots squelching through a concoction of horse manure, decaying vegetables, and unidentified detritus. The rain has relentlessly fallen for 3 consecutive days, transforming every street into a river of filth. Your stomach rumbles with a hunger that gnaws at your very being, and your throat burns with an unquenchable thirst that water alone cannot alleviate. In the distance, through the gray mist and smoke, you spot it. A wooden sign creaking in the breeze, adorned with a rudimentary depiction of a boar's head or a cluster of grapes. The inviting glow of firelight spills from modest windows, and the sounds of laughter, shouting, and what could generously be described as singing waft through the heavy wooden door. You've discovered a tavern. And whether you realize it or not, you are about to step into a world governed by its own distinct rules. A place where fortunes are made and lost with a roll of the dice, where an ill-chosen word can earn you a knife in the ribs, and where the ale might be the purest thing you consume all day. Rivers served as thoroughfares, sewers, and dumping grounds simultaneously. The Thames in London was a flowing concoction of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial effluent from tanneries and dye works, and the general debris of urban existence. Wells, when they existed, were often contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or graveyards. Even rainwater collected in barrels and cisterns quickly became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. The solution was alcohol. The brewing and fermentation process, which necessitated boiling water and generated ethanol, eradicated most of the harmful microorganisms that rendered water dangerous. This was not comprehended in scientific terms. The germ theory of disease was still centuries away. However, the practical effects were unmistakable. Individuals who consumed ale, wine, or other fermented beverages were less prone to succumbing to the enigmatic stomach ailments that plagued those who relied on water. This fostered a society where alcohol consumption commenced at birth and persisted until death. Infants received dilute ale or wine blended with water. Children consumed small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that provided sustenance and hydration without inducing intoxication. Adults throughout the day partook in stronger variants, not for inebriation, but for sustenance and well-being. The production of ale primarily constituted women's work, a domestic talent transmitted from mother to daughter, much like culinary skills or weaving. An alewife standing depended on her capacity to consistently brew flavorful ale that would ensure the health and contentment of her kin and patrons. The process combined artistry and scientific understanding, necessitating knowledge of grain quality, water sources, fermentation timing, and the numerous variables that could transform a promising batch into undrinkable refuse. The fundamental components were straightforward: malted barley, water, and yeast. The barley underwent soaking until it began to sprout, then it was dried to halt the germination process. This malting transformed the grain starches into fermentable sugars. The malted barley was then mashed with hot water to extract these sugars, yielding a sweet liquid called wort. Airborne wild yeasts would initiate natural fermentation, converting the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. However, simplicity in ingredients did not equate to simplicity in execution. Barley quality profoundly influenced everything. Grain compromised by rain, frost, or pests would yield inferior ale. The water source was paramount. Some wells produced ale with undesirable flavors, while others seemed to enhance the brewing process. Temperature control during mashing and fermentation could determine success or failure, and medieval brewers lacked thermometers, relying instead on expertise and intuition. Hops, which would later become indispensable to beer brewing, were not widely employed in medieval England until the 15th century. Instead, brewers utilized a mixture of herbs and spices known as grute to flavor and preserve their ale. Bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and dozens of other plants might be incorporated to impart a distinctive taste to ale and prolong its shelf life. Some of these additives possessed psychoactive properties, adding an extra dimension to the drinking experience absent in modern beer. The resulting beverage bore little resemblance to contemporary beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often thick enough to be consumed with a spoon, and possessed a complex flavor profile that might include notes of herbs, spices, and whatever other additions the brewer chose. It was typically consumed within a few days of brewing before it could sour or develop off flavors. The alcohol content varied significantly, from the mild small beer given to children to stronger versions capable of rendering an adult male senseless. Wine occupied a distinct social niche in medieval society. While ale was the common people's drink, wine symbolized sophistication, affluence, and religious importance. The Christian Church's use of wine in communion bestowed upon it a sacred quality that ale could never achieve. Although its higher cost made it a status symbol for the affluent, England's wine primarily originated from its continental possessions and trade partners. Gascon wine from southwestern France was the most prevalent, a red wine that was relatively affordable and transported well. Rhenish wine from the German regions along the Rhine was more expensive but highly valued for its quality. Spanish and Portuguese wines were exotic luxuries, while the sweet wines of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean were reserved for the exceptionally wealthy. The wine trade represented international commerce at its most intricate. Merchants had to navigate not only the logistical challenges of transportation, wine could spoil, freeze, or turn to vinegar during long journeys, but also the political and economic hurdles created by wars, tariffs, and trade disputes. A barrel of wine that departed Bordeaux in pristine condition might arrive in London as costly vinegar if the journey was protracted or the weather unfavorable. Wine merchants, known as vintners, were among the wealthiest and most influential members of medieval society. They maintained extensive networks of contacts across Europe, financed trading expeditions, and often served as informal bankers and diplomats. The Vintners' Company in London was one of the most powerful guilds, possessing the authority to regulate wine quality, set prices, and penalize those who violated trade standards. However, wine's prestige made it a target for fraud. Unscrupulous merchants might dilute their wine, blend expensive varieties with cheaper ones, or produce entirely counterfeit wines using any available ingredients. Alum, honey, herbs, and even more hazardous substances might be added to mimic the color, flavor, or effects of genuine wine. The penalties for such deception were severe, yet the potential profits made the risks worthwhile for some. Mead, produced from fermented honey, held a special place in medieval drinking culture. Often referred to as the drink of the gods, mead was associated with celebration, ceremony, and the warrior culture of earlier eras. It was costly to produce. Honey was a valuable commodity used for sweetening, medicine, and candle making. However, its intoxicating effects and symbolic significance justified the expense for special occasions. The brewing of mead was more an art than a science, demanding meticulous attention to the honey-to-water ratio, fermentation temperature, and the timing of various additions. Spices, fruits, and herbs might be incorporated to create diverse flavors and effects. Some meads were aged for years, developing complex flavors that could rival the finest wines. Others were consumed young, their sweetness and potency making them popular at weddings, festivals, and other celebrations. Cider and perry, made from apples and pears respectively, were regional specialties reflecting local agriculture and preferences. In areas where apple orchards flourished, cider might be more common than ale, while perry was popular in regions where pear trees grew well. These beverages could range from mildly alcoholic to potently intoxicating depending on the fruit used and the fermentation process. The seasonal nature of fruit meant that cider and perry were often available only at certain times of the year, making them special treats rather than daily staples. The finest ciders were made from specific apple varieties cultivated for their fermentation qualities rather than their eating characteristics. These cider apples were often small, sour, and unpalatable when fresh, but they yielded beverages of remarkable complexity and strength. All these alcoholic beverages shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from their modern counterparts. They were living products, continuing to ferment and evolve even after being served. They were unpredictable, with each batch potentially differing from the last. They were often contaminated with bacteria, wild yeasts, and other microorganisms that could produce unexpected flavors and effects. And they were essential to life in a way that modern drinkers can barely comprehend. The tavern keeper's skill lay not just in acquiring these beverages, but in storing, serving, and pricing them appropriately. A competent tavern keeper knew which barrels were at their peak, which were beginning to spoil, and which should be sold quickly before becoming undrinkable. He understood the preferences of his customers, the seasonal variations in supply and demand, and the delicate balance between profit and reputation that determined his success or failure. If the drinks in medieval taverns were questionable, the food was often downright hazardous. Yet, for many people, the tavern meal was the best they could hope for. A hot, filling dish that might contain actual meat and vegetables, served in portions generous enough to satisfy even the hardiest appetite. The centerpiece of tavern cuisine was pottage, a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible, and quite a few things that weren't. The concept was simple. Take a large cauldron, fill it with water or broth, add whatever ingredients were available, and let it simmer until everything was tender enough to eat. The result was a dish that was different every day, sometimes different every hour, as new ingredients were added to replace what had been served. The perpetual stew, or hunter's pot, was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. A cauldron would be kept simmering constantly, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. In theory, this created a continuously evolving dish that never ran out and never repeated itself exactly. In practice, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and a repository for ingredients of questionable origin and dubious freshness. The base of most pottages was grain, barley, oats, wheat, or whatever was cheapest and most available. This provided bulk and calories, transforming what might otherwise be a thin broth into a substantial meal. Vegetables were added when available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and whatever else could be found in the market or foraged from the countryside. Meat, when it appeared in pottage, was often of uncertain origin and questionable quality. Beef, pork, mutton, and chicken were the most common, but rabbit, deer, and other game might find their way into the pot when available. The meat was typically tough, stringy, and well past its prime, the kind of cuts that required long, slow cooking to become even marginally edible. But it wasn't just the quality of the meat that was concerning, it was the source. Tavern keepers were not above using meat that had been rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cuts that had been sitting in the market for days without finding a purchaser. The long cooking process would kill most harmful bacteria, but it couldn't eliminate the off flavors and textures that came with spoiled meat. Fish constituted another prevalent dietary component, particularly during Lent and other periods when church decrees forbade meat consumption. However, medieval preservation methods were rudimentary, meaning fish transported any considerable distance from the coast was typically heavily salted, dried, or pickled. Fresh fish was a rare indulgence that few taverns could offer, and even when available, it required prompt consumption to prevent spoilage. The spices employed in pottage reflected both feasibility and cost-effectiveness. Salt was costly and subject to heavy taxation, rendering it a precious commodity used sparingly. Herbs such as parsley, thyme, and sage might be incorporated when accessible, either freshly picked from gardens or dried from the preceding season. Spices largely remained outside the financial reach of most tavern proprietors, although a prosperous establishment might occasionally splurge on pepper, ginger, or other exotic flavorings. The cooking process itself was fraught with perils. The large cauldrons utilized for pottage were challenging to clean thoroughly, and remnants from previous batches could contaminate new ones. The fires used for cooking were smoky and unpredictable, making it difficult to maintain consistent temperatures. Stirring was performed with long wooden spoons that might not be sanitized between uses, thereby disseminating flavors and bacteria from one batch to the next. Bread was the other fundamental element of tavern meals, yet its quality varied enormously, much like everything else. The finest taverns might offer white bread crafted from wheat flour, a luxurious item that was soft, flavorful, and relatively fresh. More commonly, patrons received brown bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains, often several days old and sufficiently rigid to serve as a weapon. The most inferior bread was manufactured from the most inexpensive grain available, frequently mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to extend the flour supply. This bread was dense, gritty, and barely edible, but it provided calories and helped satiate hunger. It was often employed as a trencher, an edible plate on which other foods were served, and by meal's end, it had absorbed enough juices and flavors to become palatable. Cheese was another common provision, ranging from fresh, delicate varieties that required swift consumption to aged, hard cheeses capable of lasting for months. Its quality was dependent on its origin. Cheese produced from the milk of healthy animals by adept cheesemakers could be delectable, whereas cheese from dubious milk made by unskilled hands could be inedible or even hazardous. Eggs, when obtainable, were a welcome addition to the tavern menu. They could be boiled, fried, or added to pottage to supply protein and richness. Yet eggs were perishable, and without refrigeration, it was challenging to differentiate fresh eggs from spoiled ones until they were cracked open. A bad egg could ruin an entire dish and leave customers with vivid, unpleasant memories of their tavern experience. Vegetables were seasonal and frequently scarce, particularly during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots could be stored for months in cool cellars, but they often became soft, sprouted, or partially rotten before use. Cabbage could be preserved through fermentation, creating sauerkraut that supplied vitamins and flavor during the lean periods. The preparation of food in medieval taverns was a communal event, with multiple dishes being prepared simultaneously in the same kitchen area. Cross-contamination was inevitable, as the same utensils, cutting boards, and preparation surfaces were used for different ingredients without adequate cleaning between uses. Raw meat might be prepared on the same surface as bread. Vegetables might be washed in the same water used for cleaning dishes, and cooked food might be stored alongside raw ingredients. Preservation presented an ongoing challenge. Lacking refrigeration, food had to be consumed rapidly or preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or fermentation. These preservation methods dramatically altered the flavor and texture of food, often rendering it barely recognizable from its fresh state. Salt pork bore little resemblance to fresh pork. Dried fish offered a completely different experience from fresh fish, and fermented vegetables possessed flavors that could be challenging even for medieval palates. The serving of food was as disorganized as its preparation. Dishes were often shared among numerous customers, with everyone eating from the same bowl or platter. Personal hygiene was poor, and the concept of individual place settings was non-existent. Customers ate with their hands, shared knives, and drank from communal cups, spreading diseases and parasites with every meal. Despite all these difficulties, tavern food fulfilled a vital social and nutritional role. For many individuals, especially those residing in cities, the tavern meal was their primary source of hot, cooked food. It provided calories, protein, and at least some vitamins and minerals that might be lacking in their regular diet. It was also a shared experience, bringing people together around common tables and fostering opportunities for conversation, commerce, and community building. The successful tavern keeper understood that food encompassed more than mere nutrition. It was about hospitality, comfort, and the cultivation of an atmosphere that would encourage customers to return. A bowl of well-prepared pottage served hot and accompanied by fresh bread and good ale could transform a cold, wet, dismal day into something tolerable. It may not have been gourmet cuisine, but it was sustenance for both body and soul. Entering any medieval tavern, one would encounter a diverse cast of characters that would delight a modern crime novelist. These were not the idealized peasants and noble knights of romantic literature, but real individuals existing on the fringes of society, each with their own narrative, their own motivations, and their own particular potential for danger. Merchants were perhaps the most conspicuous and vocal of the tavern's regular patrons. These men, almost exclusively male, traversed the hazardous roads between towns and cities, transporting goods, news, and frequently significant sums of money. They were natural storytellers, entertaining anyone willing to listen with tales of distant markets, exotic commodities, and the perils of travel. Yet beneath their cheerful exteriors lay shrewd minds constantly assessing profit and loss, and eyes that overlooked nothing of value. A thriving merchant in a medieval tavern was like a walking advertisement for prosperity, adorned in fine clothing, displaying jewelry that proclaimed his wealth, and speaking with the confidence of a man who had experienced the world beyond village confines. However, this exhibition of wealth made him a target for every pickpocket, swindler, and outright robber in the establishment. Prudent merchants traveled in groups, employed guards, and kept their most valuable possessions concealed. But even the most cautious could find themselves relieved of their goods by a clever thief or a well-orchestrated ambush. Less successful merchants were often more dangerous than their prosperous counterparts. Desperate men with struggling businesses, mounting debts, and families to support were capable of almost anything. They might sell goods they didn't possess, promise deliveries they couldn't fulfill, or enter into partnerships with criminals to recoup their losses. A merchant on the brink of bankruptcy was a man with nothing left to lose. And such men were unpredictable and potentially violent. Soldiers were another common sight in medieval taverns, and their presence could either ensure peace or guarantee trouble, depending on their mood, their sobriety, and their recent experiences. Veterans of foreign wars brought with them not just scars and stories, but also a nonchalant attitude toward violence that could escalate a simple disagreement into a bloodbath. They were skilled with weapons, accustomed to taking what they needed, and often suffering from what we would now identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. The best soldiers were disciplined professionals who understood that their reputation was their most valuable asset. They might be hired as guards, escorts, or enforcers, and their presence in a tavern could actually enhance safety for other patrons. But even good soldiers could be pushed too far, especially when drink loosened their tongues and old grievances surfaced. The worst soldiers were little better than bandits with military training, deserters, discharged veterans with no other skills, and mercenaries between contracts often resorted to crime to survive. They knew how to fight, how to kill, and how to intimidate, making them formidable opponents for anyone foolish enough to cross them. The medieval tavern was more than just a drinking establishment. It served as the pulsing heart of community life. It was the unofficial town hall, the stock market, the employment agency, and the entertainment hub, all coalesced into one smoke-filled, tumultuous, vibrantly alive institution. Yet it was also a locale where peril lurked in every shadow, where maladies spread quicker than rumors, and where the unwary could lose all their possessions before the night concluded. Tonight, we will reveal the reality beneath the romanticized facade that centuries of narratives have cast over these establishments. We will explore the true taverns of medieval Europe, not the sanitized versions of Hollywood, but the authentic article in all its grimy, violent, captivating splendor. We'll uncover what you would genuinely eat and drink, who you would encounter, what games you would play, and most importantly, how you might survive the experience. Because make no mistake, visiting a medieval tavern was an adventure in the truest sense of the word. And like all genuine adventures, it carried inherent risks. The initial thing that would strike you upon entering a medieval tavern wasn't the sight or the sound. It was the aroma, a complex bouquet of scents that would assail your nostrils with the subtlety of a gauntleted fist. Imagine, if you will, The concentrated essence of unwashed bodies mingled with the sour tang of spilled ale, the acrid smoke from inadequately ventilated fires, and the mysterious yet undeniable odor of things that had been left to ferment in obscure corners for far too long. The floors, if they could be so called, were typically nothing more than compacted earth covered with a layer of rushes, long grasses intended to absorb spills and provide some semblance of cleanliness. Theoretically, these rushes were replaced regularly. In practice, they often remained in situ for months, slowly decomposing into a rich ecosystem of decaying organic matter, dropped food, and the occasional tiny corpse of whatever vermin had met its untimely end in the tavern's depths. A tavern filled with unemployed soldiers was a powder keg awaiting a spark. Pilgrims represented a different kind of peril. Not physical violence, but moral corruption. These supposedly devout travelers were often the most worldly individuals in the tavern, having witnessed more of life than local residents could conceptualize. Some were genuine seekers of spiritual enlightenment, but others were utilizing pilgrimage as an excuse for adventure, escape from legal troubles, or simply an extended vacation from domestic responsibilities. The Canterbury Tales offers a vivid portrayal of medieval pilgrims, and it is not always flattering. Chaucer's pilgrims include a corrupt pardoner selling fake relics, a summoner who accepts bribes to overlook sins, and a wife of Bath who has outlived 5 husbands and is seeking a 6th. These were individuals who understood how to manipulate religious sentiment for personal gain, and they were often more dangerous than obvious criminals because they concealed their true nature behind a facade of piety. Craftsmen and artisans comprised another significant group within the tavern population. These proficient laborers, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and numerous other trades formed the cornerstone of the medieval economy. Generally, they enjoyed greater prosperity than common laborers, but possessed less wealth than successful merchants, occupying a middle ground that elicited both envy and resentment from those higher and lower on the social hierarchy. Membership in guilds bestowed a certain status and protection upon craftsmen, yet it also fostered rivalries and conflicts that could escalate into violence. Various guilds vied for clientele, contested territorial boundaries, and battled over the right to practice particular trades. A tavern might serve as neutral territory for resolving these disputes, or it could transform into a battlefield where old grievances were settled with fists and knives. The most perilous craftsmen were those who had been expelled from their guilds or who plied their trades without proper authorization. These individuals possessed skills but lacked legitimate avenues for their use, making them natural recruits for criminal endeavors. A blacksmith capable of forging weapons and picking locks, a carpenter skilled in constructing secret compartments and hidden passages, or a weaver artful in creating disguises and false documents. All were valuable assets to the criminal underworld. Clergy members were surprisingly prevalent in medieval taverns, despite official church disapproval of such establishments. Parish priests, itinerant monks, and minor church officials frequently found themselves in taverns, either out of necessity or by choice. Some were genuinely pious individuals with no other option for food and lodging during their travels. Others utilized their religious status as a cover for less sanctified activities. The corrupt clergyman was a stock character in medieval literature, yet also a tangible presence in medieval taverns. These men possessed education, connections, and moral authority that they could exploit for personal gain. They might peddle false indulgences, officiate illegal marriages, or offer sanctuary to criminals in exchange for payment. Their presence in a tavern could legitimize the establishment in the eyes of some patrons while instilling deep suspicion in others. Women in medieval taverns occupied a complex and often perilous position. Alewives, who managed many establishments, were businesswomen in their own right, but they were also susceptible to accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or other offenses that could ruin their reputations and livelihoods. Serving wenches endured constant harassment and the threat of sexual violence, while prostitutes operated within a legal gray area that left them at the mercy of both customers and authorities. However, medieval women were not passive victims. Many were adept in the use of knives, poisons, and other weapons, and they were often more ruthless than their male counterparts when threatened. A tavern keeper's wife might be the true power behind the establishment, leveraging her knowledge of customers' secrets and weaknesses to maintain order and extract payment. Female criminals frequently exploited their supposed weakness and innocence as weapons, luring victims into traps or manipulating men to do their bidding. Thieves and cutpurses were the most overt criminals in any tavern, but they were also often the most skilled at blending in with legitimate patrons. The most accomplished thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants, craftsmen, or travelers until the moment they struck. They meticulously observed their victims, learning their habits, vulnerabilities, and the location of their valuables before making their move. Professional thieves frequently operated in teams, with one member creating a diversion while another picked pockets or severed purse strings. They might pose as fellow travelers, sympathetic listeners, or prospective business partners to get close to their victims. The most successful thieves were those who could steal without their victims even realizing they had been robbed until hours or days later. However, not all thieves were professionals. Desperate individuals driven to crime by poverty, debt, or other circumstances were often clumsy and dangerous. They might resort to violence when stealth failed, transforming a simple theft into assault or murder. These amateur criminals were unpredictable and often more dangerous than their professional counterparts because they had no reputation to safeguard and no code of conduct to adhere to. The tavern keeper himself was often the most dangerous person in the establishment. He controlled the environment, knew all the customers, and possessed the authority to settle disputes or summon local authorities for assistance. Yet he was also a businessman operating in a legal gray area. His survival depended on his ability to balance the competing interests of customers, suppliers, and officials. A corrupt tavern keeper might fence stolen goods, provide alibis for criminals, or arrange for the elimination of troublesome customers. He might dilute drinks, serve spoiled food, or charge exorbitant prices to patrons who were too intoxicated or intimidated to complain. His establishment might serve as a meeting place for criminal conspiracies, a safe house for fugitives, or a base of operations for organized crime. But even honest tavern keepers had to make moral compromises to survive. They might turn a blind eye when crimes were committed on their premises, accept payment from criminals for their silence, or provide services that were technically illegal but widely accepted. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was often blurred beyond recognition. This rogues gallery of medieval tavern patrons created an atmosphere of incessant tension and unpredictability. Alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate needs and opportunities. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and betrayal was always just a drink away. In this environment, survival hinged on one's ability to quickly assess individuals, accurately gauge threats, and respond appropriately to shifting circumstances. The social dynamics of the medieval tavern were intricate and ever-changing. Status, wealth, and power were continually negotiated and renegotiated through subtle demonstrations of dominance, submission, and alliance. A single misinterpreted gesture, an ill-timed joke, or a perceived slight could escalate into violence that might leave several people dead and the survivors facing murder charges. Nevertheless, despite its dangers, the medieval tavern fulfilled a crucial social function. It was one of the few places where individuals from different social classes, professions, and backgrounds could interact on relatively equal terms. A merchant might share a table with a craftsman, a soldier might drink with a priest, and a noble might find himself gambling with a thief. These interactions, however brief and superficial, helped to dismantle some of the rigid social barriers that characterized medieval society. The tavern was also a place where information flowed freely. News, gossip, rumors, and secrets were exchanged like commodities, and a skilled listener could glean more in a single evening than he might discover in weeks of formal inquiry. This made the tavern valuable to merchants seeking market information, officials gathering intelligence, and criminals planning their next moves. In the flickering candlelight of medieval taverns, fortunes were won and lost with the roll of dice, the turn of a card, or the outcome of contests that tested both skill and luck. Gambling wasn't merely entertainment. It was a way of life, a means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin that claimed victims from every stratum of society. Dice were the most popular gambling implements in medieval taverns, and for good reason. They were small, portable, and could be fashioned from readily available materials like bone, wood, or stone. The basic concept was simple enough for even the most illiterate peasant to comprehend, yet complex enough to sustain interest through long nights of play. However, medieval dice games were far from the standardized casino games of today. They were wild, unpredictable affairs where the rules shifted with the players, and cheating was regarded more as an art form than a crime. The most common dice game was hazard, a precursor to modern craps that involved betting on the outcome of 2 dice throws. The player would name a number between 5 and 9 as his main, then attempt to roll that number before rolling certain other combinations that would result in a loss. It sounds straightforward, but the betting possibilities were endless, with side wagers on individual throws, sequences of throws, and the performance of other players creating a complex web of financial obligations that could bankrupt a man in minutes. But hazard was just one of dozens of dice games played in medieval taverns. There was raffle, where players tried to throw 3 dice resulting in the same number. There was mum chance, a game so reliant on luck that it became synonymous with random fortune. There was passage, where players bet on whether they could throw doubles with 2 dice. Each game had its own rules, its own betting structure, and its own opportunities for skilled players to gain an advantage over their opponents. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from the bones of exotic animals or crafted from precious materials like ivory or jet. Wealthy players might possess sets of dice made from different materials for different games, while poorer players made do with crude wooden cubes that were barely symmetrical. But regardless of their construction, all dice were suspect. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with duplicate numbers were common, and players developed elaborate rituals for inspecting dice before play commenced. The most skilled dice players were those who could cheat without being detected. They might employ sleight of hand to swap loaded dice for fair ones, utilize accomplices to divert other players at pivotal junctures, or use subtle signals to coordinate their wagers with associates. The most adept cheaters were so skillful that they could manipulate game outcomes while presenting themselves as victims of misfortune. However, dice were not the sole gambling games in medieval taverns. Cards, though less prevalent than dice, steadily gained popularity throughout the later medieval period. The earliest playing cards were meticulously hand-painted artworks, far too costly for general use, but by the 14th century, printed cards became more accessible and widespread. Medieval card games bore scant resemblance to modern poker or blackjack. They frequently involved matching suits or sequences with intricate scoring systems that rewarded both luck and proficiency. Primero, a precursor to poker, involved wagering on the strength of one's hand. Yet, the hand rankings differed from contemporary poker, and the betting framework was more fluid and unpredictable. The most perilous aspect of medieval card games was not the games themselves, but the unavoidable accusations of cheating that emerged. Marked cards, dealing from the deck's bottom, and collusion among players were common. Nevertheless, proving cheating was challenging and often culminated in violence. A player accused of cheating might encounter not only the forfeiture of their winnings, but also a knife in the ribs or a challenge to single combat. Beyond dice and cards, medieval taverns hosted a bewildering array of gambling activities. Arm wrestling contests, drinking competitions, and tests of skill or knowledge all presented opportunities for wagering. Patrons might bet on which of 2 flies would reach the ceiling first, whether the next person entering would be male or female, or the number of beans in a jar. Anything with an uncertain outcome could become the subject of a wager. Cockfighting was particularly popular in taverns possessing outdoor space or able to accommodate the sport's noise and mess. 2 roosters, specifically bred and trained for fighting, would be placed in a pit while spectators wagered on the outcome. The fights were brutal and frequently resulted in the death of one or both birds, but the excitement and betting opportunities rendered them irresistible to many tavern goers. Bear baiting and bull baiting were less common but even more spectacular. A bear or bull would be chained to a post and attacked by specially trained dogs while spectators bet on various aspects of the contest. Which dog would draw first blood? How long would the bear endure? Whether any of the dogs would perish. These events were costly to organize and necessitated specialized facilities. Thus, they were typically reserved for special occasions or particularly affluent establishments. The social dynamics of gambling in medieval taverns were intricate and often perilous. Winning excessively rapidly could brand a player as a cheat or a target for robbery. Losing too much could lead to desperate attempts to recoup losses, frequently ending in violence or crime. The most successful gamblers were those who could win consistently without appearing overly skilled or too fortunate. Professional gamblers, known as dicers or card sharps, traversed from tavern to tavern, earning their livelihood from their prowess at games of chance. They were often welcomed by tavern keepers as they attracted customers and generated business. However, they were also viewed with suspicion by local players who resented being outplayed by outsiders. The most accomplished professional gamblers were those who could lose gracefully when required, winning just enough to subsist without inciting excessive suspicion or resentment. But gambling in medieval taverns wasn't solely about money. Social status, reputation, and honor were also at stake. A nobleman who consistently lost to a peasant might find his social standing diminished, while a merchant caught cheating might find his business reputation ruined. The stakes were often higher than the actual money involved, and the consequences of losing could extend far beyond the tavern walls. Women also participated in gambling, though their involvement was often more subtle and indirect than that of men. Tavern owners might organize games in their establishments, taking a percentage of the winnings as payment for providing the venue. Serving wenches might act as lookouts for cheaters or convey messages between players and their confederates. Prostitutes might leverage their intimate relationships with customers to gain information about their gambling habits and financial resources. The church officially condemned gambling as a sin. Yet this prohibition was widely disregarded by both clergy and laity. Many priests and monks were known to be avid gamblers, and some taverns even hosted special games during religious festivals. The church's opposition to gambling stemmed more from its association with other vices, drinking, fighting, and sexual immorality, than from any inherent evil in games of chance themselves. Local authorities had a more pragmatic approach to gambling. They recognized that it was impossible to eliminate entirely, so they focused on regulating it to prevent the worst abuses. Laws were enacted limiting the stakes that could be wagered, prohibiting certain types of games, and requiring tavern keepers to maintain order during gambling sessions. However, enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt, with officials accepting bribes to turn a blind eye or participating in the games themselves. The economic impact of gambling on medieval society was significant. Substantial sums of money regularly changed hands, creating winners and losers whose fortunes could shift overnight. Successful gamblers might utilize their winnings to invest in legitimate businesses, while losers might be compelled to sell their possessions, borrow money at exorbitant rates, or resort to crime to settle their debts. Gambling debts were a particular problem because they were often not legally enforceable. A man who lost money gambling might simply refuse to pay, leaving his creditors with no legal recourse. This led to the development of informal enforcement mechanisms, threats, violence, and social ostracism that were often more effective than legal remedies but also more perilous for all involved. The psychology of gambling in medieval taverns was shaped by the harsh realities of medieval life. For most people, life was a perpetual struggle against poverty, disease, and premature death. Gambling offered the possibility, however remote, of escaping these constraints through a single lucky throw of the dice or turn of the cards. It was a form of hope, however irrational, that tomorrow might surpass today. Yet gambling also mirrored the medieval understanding of fate and fortune in a world where random events, plague, war, famine, natural disasters, could obliterate lives without warning. The notion that luck played a significant role in human affairs was widely accepted. Gambling was simply a means of attempting to influence or predict the workings of fate, a form of divination disguised as entertainment. The rituals and superstitions surrounding gambling in medieval taverns were elaborate and deeply ingrained. Players might carry lucky charms, perform specific rituals before casting dice, or refuse to play on certain days or under certain conditions. Dice might be blessed by priests, cards might be kept in special containers, and gaming tables might be consecrated with holy water or adorned with protective symbols. These superstitions were not merely quaint customs. They were earnest attempts to influence game outcomes through supernatural means. In a world where magic and religion were interwoven with daily life, the idea that spiritual forces could affect the fall of dice or the turn of cards was perfectly rational. Players who disregarded these rituals did so at their own peril, not solely because they might be unlucky, but because other players might perceive their skepticism as dangerous or impious. The language of gambling permeated medieval culture, furnishing metaphors and expressions that are still in use today. To cast the die meant to make an irreversible decision, while the die is cast indicated that events had been set in motion that could not be halted. Walking across these floors was akin to traversing a spongy, unpredictable terrain. Your feet might sink into soft spots where ale had seeped through to the earth below, or crunch on the bones of long-forgotten meals. More opulent establishments might feature actual wooden floors, but even these were stained dark with years of spills and scarred by countless knife fights, dice games gone awry, and the general wear and tear of serving as the stage for humanity's baser instincts. The walls, constructed of wattle and daub, a mixture of interwoven wooden strips covered with mud, straw, and animal dung, were blackened with smoke and grease. They exuded moisture in winter and radiated heat in summer, creating a perpetually uncomfortable microclimate. Crude paintings or carvings might adorn these walls, often depicting religious scenes, royal heraldry, or more earthly pleasures, depending on the establishment's clientele and the owner's sense of decorum. But it was the ceiling that truly completed the atmospheric experience. Low, oppressive, and blackened by decades of smoke, it seemed to press down on the occupants like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams, often repurposed from ships or felled from ancient forests, supported the structure above. From these beams dangled all manner of objects: dried herbs that did little to mask the pervasive odors, strings of onions and garlic, cuts of bacon or ham in various stages of preservation, and sometimes the more grim remnants of patrons who had failed to settle their debts or had otherwise offended the establishment's sense of justice. The primary illumination emanated from the grand hearth that dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made every face appear sinister, and every corner seemed to conceal potential threats. Candles, when affordable, provided additional light, but their flickering glow only intensified the pervading sense of unease within these venues. The smoke from both fire and candles had no escape route but upwards, where it accumulated beneath the low ceiling before eventually escaping through gaps in the thatch or crude smoke holes that did little to improve air quality. In this environment, every breath was an adventure. The air was thick enough to chew, laden with particles of soot, grease, and the exhalations of dozens of people who considered bathing a seasonal activity at best. Newcomers often found themselves coughing and wheezing, their eyes streaming tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the simple act of attempting to breathe. A dicey situation was one where the outcome was uncertain, whereas someone who was on a roll was experiencing a streak of good fortune. These linguistic connections mirrored the central role that gambling played in medieval life. It was not merely a pastime or a vice. It was a fundamental component of how people comprehended and interacted with the surrounding world. The tavern was where this understanding was tested, refined, and sometimes shattered by the cruel realities of chance and human nature. Violence in medieval taverns was not an anomaly. It was an intrinsic part of the social fabric, as anticipated and inevitable as the sunrise. In a world where might often equaled right and personal honor was valued above life itself, the tavern functioned as both a pressure valve and a proving ground for the aggressive impulses that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. The causes of tavern violence were as diverse as the individuals who frequented these establishments. A perceived insult, a disputed debt, a woman's honor, a political disagreement, or simply too much ale could ignite a confrontation that might conclude in bloodshed. But comprehending the triggers was less crucial than grasping the culture that rendered violence not merely acceptable, but often necessary for survival and social standing. Honor was the currency of medieval society, a currency that could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A person who accepted insults without retaliation could permanently damage their reputation, inhibiting their social standing, business prospects, marital opportunities, and peer respect. In this context, violence was often not merely an option, but the sole recourse for maintaining social position. The weaponry accessible in medieval taverns was restricted by law and custom. Yet inventiveness and desperation could transform almost anything into a lethal instrument. Knives, commonly carried by nearly everyone for eating and general utility, were the most prevalent weapons. These were not the diminutive table knives of today, but substantial blades capable of inflicting severe wounds. A skilled combatant could dispatch an adversary in moments. Even an amateur could cause significant harm within the confined space of a crowded tavern. Swords were less frequently seen in taverns, partly due to their expense and customary restriction to nobility and military personnel. However, when swords did appear in tavern brawls, the outcomes were typically dramatic and sanguinary. The constricted environment of a tavern rendered sword fighting particularly perilous for bystanders, as uncontrolled swings could readily injure innocent patrons or damage the building's infrastructure. More often, tavern brawlers resorted to improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, pottery fragments became cutting tools, and even eating utensils could serve as weapons. The robust pewter or wooden tankards used for drinking ale were particularly effective bludgeons, capable of fracturing skulls or breaking bones with a single well-aimed strike. The fighting styles observed in medieval taverns were brutal and pragmatic, prioritizing swift conflict resolution over demonstrating skill or adhering to chivalric rules. Grappling, gouging, biting, and kicking were all acceptable tactics, with combatants frequently targeting vulnerable areas such as the eyes, throat, and groin. The objective was not to injure or incapacitate an opponent, but to kill or render them helpless before they could do the same. Group altercations were especially chaotic and hazardous. What began as a dispute between two individuals could rapidly escalate into a general melee involving dozens. Alliances formed and dissolved instantly as patrons sided based on personal relationships, ethnic loyalties, or simple proximity to the action. In such situations, survival often hinged more on fortune than aptitude, as fighters struggled to avoid being overwhelmed by multiple adversaries or struck by airborne objects. The involvement of women in tavern violence was intricate and often underestimated by contemporary observers. While women were less inclined to engage in direct physical confrontation, they frequently instigated violence, leveraging their relationships with men to manipulate conflicts for their own advantage. A woman might incite her lover to fight a rival, supply weapons or intelligence to one party in a conflict, or employ accusations of sexual impropriety to ruin an enemy's reputation. When women did participate in physical violence, they were often more vicious and unpredictable than their male counterparts. Female tavern owners were renowned for their ability to maintain order through a blend of intimidation and violence, wielding rolling pins, ladles, and other kitchen implements with deadly precision. Serving wenches learned to defend themselves against unwanted advances using whatever was at hand, and their intimate knowledge of the tavern's layout provided them significant advantages in close-quarters combat. The aftermath of tavern violence was often as perilous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might succumb to their injuries days or weeks later, transforming what seemed like a minor skirmish into a murder case. Families and friends of the injured or deceased might seek retribution, initiating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. Legal authorities could become involved, leading to trials, executions, or other official punishments that could devastate entire families. The economic ramifications of tavern violence were also substantial. Property damage from fights necessitated repairs or replacements, often at considerable expense. Injured patrons might be unable to work, affecting their capacity to pay debts or support their families. Deceased patrons, naturally, could not settle their bills, leaving tavern owners to absorb the losses. The reputation of a tavern known for frequent violence could suffer, deterring customers and reducing profits. However, violence also fulfilled important social functions in medieval taverns. It served as a means of establishing and maintaining social hierarchies, with stronger or more skilled fighters earning respect and deference from their peers. It provided entertainment for spectators who might wager on fight outcomes, or simply relish the excitement of watching others risk their lives. It was also a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable or ineffective. The rituals surrounding tavern violence held as much importance as the violence itself. Challenges might be issued according to specific formulas, with particular words or gestures carrying precise meanings. The selection of weapons, the fight location, and the presence or absence of witnesses all bore significance beyond immediate practical considerations. These rituals helped legitimize violence and differentiate between acceptable and unacceptable forms of aggression. Professional fighters, including soldiers, mercenaries, and others whose livelihoods depended on their combat prowess, introduced a distinct dynamic to tavern violence. They were often more skilled and experienced than ordinary patrons, but also more prone to escalating conflicts beyond what the situation warranted. A professional fighter might view a tavern brawl as an opportunity to showcase skills or enhance reputation, leading to unnecessarily brutal or prolonged conflicts. The weapons and fighting techniques employed by professionals were frequently superior to those of amateurs, but also more likely to result in severe injuries or fatalities. A mercenary adept in battlefield combat might not comprehend the unspoken rules governing tavern violence, leading to conflicts that far exceeded locally accepted norms. The seasonal patterns of tavern violence mirrored the rhythms of medieval life. Violence was more prevalent during specific times of the year, such as harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days, when people had more money for drink and more reasons to gather in large numbers. Winter months, when people were confined indoors and tensions ran high, also saw increased levels of violence. The time of day also influenced the likelihood and severity of tavern violence. Early evening fights were often relatively minor affairs, quickly resolved before they could escalate. But as the night progressed and patrons became more intoxicated, conflicts grew more serious and more likely to result in permanent injury or death. The hours just before dawn were particularly hazardous, as exhausted, drunk, and emotionally volatile patrons were most inclined to resort to extreme violence. The legal response to tavern violence varied significantly depending on the jurisdiction, the social status of those involved, and the severity of injuries inflicted. Minor altercations might be entirely overlooked by authorities, especially if no one was seriously hurt and participants were willing to settle differences privately. More severe violence could lead to fines, imprisonment, or even execution, particularly if the victim held high social standing or if the violence was perceived as threatening public order. However, the legal system's response to tavern violence was often inconsistent and corrupt. Wealthy or well-connected individuals might evade punishment for serious crimes, while impoverished or unpopular defendants might face harsh penalties for minor offenses. Witnesses might be intimidated or bribed. Evidence might be destroyed or fabricated, and judges might be swayed by personal relationships or financial considerations. The Church's official stance on tavern violence was condemnatory, yet practically ambivalent. While Church doctrine preached against violence and advocated peace and reconciliation, many clergy members were themselves frequent participants in tavern culture and occasional participants in tavern violence. The Church's emphasis on concepts like just war and righteous anger provided theological justification for violence in certain contexts, and the medieval understanding of honor and masculinity often clashed with Christian ideals of humility and forgiveness. The medical treatment available for victims of tavern violence was primitive and often more dangerous than the original injuries. Wounds might be cleansed with wine or vinegar, stitched with whatever thread was available, and treated with herbal remedies of questionable efficacy. Broken bones were set without anesthesia, and amputations were performed with crude tools and no understanding of antiseptic procedures. Many victims of tavern violence died not from their initial injuries, but from infections, blood loss, or complications arising from inadequate medical care. Those who survived might be permanently disabled, affecting their ability to work and support themselves and their families. The long-term consequences of tavern violence thus extended far beyond the immediate participants, impacting entire communities and generations. The psychological impact of tavern violence on both participants and witnesses was significant but poorly understood in medieval times. What we currently identify as post-traumatic stress disorder was a common affliction among individuals who had endured or observed severe acts of violence. Yet it was frequently misattributed to moral failing, divine retribution, or supernatural influences. The absence of effective treatments for psychological trauma meant that the repercussions of violence could linger for many years, even decades. Notwithstanding these adverse outcomes, violence remained an intrinsic component of tavern culture throughout the medieval epoch. It was too deeply interwoven into the social, economic, and psychological frameworks of medieval society to be eradicated by legal statutes, religious dogma, or societal pressure. Taverns afforded a venue where violent impulses, typically suppressed in other environments, could find expression. This function was as vital to medieval society as the tavern's role in providing sustenance, beverages, and refuge. In the dimly lit recesses and upper chambers of medieval taverns, another long-standing profession conducted its affairs with a blend of desperation, shrewdness, and a resigned acceptance of society's moral paradoxes. Prostitution was not merely tolerated in medieval taverns. It was often an essential element of the business model, generating additional revenue for tavern proprietors and extra amenities for patrons with disposable income and desires to satisfy. The women who engaged in prostitution within medieval taverns originated from diverse backgrounds, though widespread poverty served as the unifying factor in their narratives. Some were widows who had lost their spouses to warfare, illness, or accidents, possessing no other means to sustain themselves and their offspring. Others were young women who had been seduced and subsequently abandoned, their reputations tarnished, and their matrimonial prospects ruined. Still others were simply products of a society that offered limited legitimate avenues for women to secure a living wage. The Church officially denounced prostitution as a mortal sin, yet even religious authorities acknowledged its practical necessity. St. Augustine famously argued that prostitution resembled sewers in a palace, unsavory but indispensable to avert more profound corruption. This pragmatic perspective led to an intricate system of regulation and tolerance that exhibited considerable variation across different locations and time periods. In certain urban centers, prostitution was entirely legal and supervised by municipal authorities. Licensed brothels operated openly, their workers subjected to routine health inspections and mandated to wear distinctive attire that denoted their profession. These establishments paid taxes, adhered to specific operational guidelines, and were generally accepted as a necessary evil by the broader community. However, within taverns, the situation was more ambiguous. Prostitution might be tolerated as long as it was discreet, or it could be officially prescribed while being tacitly encouraged. Tavern owners navigated a precarious balance between maximizing their profits and sidestepping legal entanglements, often relying on bribery, political connections, or sheer geographical isolation to safeguard their operations. The working conditions for prostitutes in medieval taverns were arduous and perilous. They possessed minimal defense against violent or abusive patrons, lacked recourse when clients defaulted on payments, and faced constant exposure to sexually transmitted diseases that could be disfiguring or fatal. Pregnancy constituted an occupational hazard that could terminate a woman's career, and the rudimentary contraception and abortion methods available at the time were frequently more hazardous than childbirth itself. The financial arrangements between prostitutes and tavern owners displayed considerable diversity. Some women functioned as independent contractors, leasing rooms from the tavern owner and retaining the majority of their earnings. Others were essentially employees, receiving a percentage of their fees while the tavern owner provided lodging, sustenance, and protection. The most dire circumstances involved women who were virtually enslaved, ensnared by debt, violence, or legal constraints that rendered escape impossible. The clientele who sought the services of tavern prostitutes were as varied as the women who served them. Merchants traveling far from home, soldiers on leave from military campaigns, artisans commemorating successful business ventures, and local men seeking novelty or excitement all contributed to the demand for commercial sex. The anonymity inherent in the tavern environment made it simpler for men to engage in behaviors that might be socially unacceptable within their home communities. The prices levied for sexual services fluctuated based on the woman's appearance, age, and reputation, as well as the specific services requested and the economic conditions of the local vicinity. A youthful, attractive woman in a prosperous city might command prices sufficient for a comfortable living, whereas an older woman in a poverty-stricken rural area might barely earn enough for survival. The most successful prostitutes were often those capable of attracting regular customers willing to pay premium rates for exclusive access or specialized treatment. Yet prostitution in medieval taverns transcended mere sexual activity. It encompassed companionship, amusement, and emotional connection. Many customers were lonely individuals, far from their homes, who valued conversation and affection as much as physical gratification. Successful prostitutes learned to embody the roles of actresses, therapists, and confidants, in addition to sexual partners, adapting their personalities to cater to the emotional requirements of their clients. The relationships between prostitutes and other tavern staff were intricate and frequently fraught with tension. Serving wenches might resent the competition for customers' attention and money, while tavern owners might show favoritism among their workers to optimize profits. Male employees might exploit their positions to demand sexual favors, while female employees might forge alliances for mutual protection and support. The legal standing of prostitutes was precarious and subject to constant change. They might be apprehended and fined for practicing their trade, then subsequently released to resume working because authorities acknowledged the impossibility of total eradication of prostitution. They might be compelled to reside in specific urban districts, wear distinctive attire, or undergo regular health examinations. During periods of social or political turmoil, they might be scapegoated for broader societal problems and subjected to particularly harsh treatment. The health risks associated with prostitution in medieval times were enormous. Sexually transmitted diseases were widespread and frequently lethal, with no effective treatments available. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections could lead to blindness, insanity, and death. While pregnancy and childbirth carried their own substantial dangers, the limited understanding of disease transmission meant that both prostitutes and their clients were largely unaware of the perils they faced. Violence posed another perpetual threat. Customers might turn violent when intoxicated, refuse payment for services, or assault prostitutes for reasons ranging from sexual frustration to religious guilt. The isolated nature of many taverns made it challenging for prostitutes to summon aid, and their low social status often meant that authorities were disinclined to thoroughly investigate crimes committed against them. The psychological burden of prostitution was severe but rarely recognized in medieval times. Women who entered the profession often experienced shame, depression, and a sense of despair, compounded by social ostracism and religious condemnation. The constant necessity to perform emotional and sexual labor for strangers while suppressing their own feelings and desires generated psychological stress for which there was no acknowledged treatment or support. Despite these formidable challenges, some prostitutes managed to achieve a degree of success and independence. The most skilled and fortunate might accumulate sufficient capital to retire from active prostitution and establish themselves as madams, overseeing other women and receiving a percentage of their earnings. Others might attract affluent patrons who provided them with financial security in exchange for exclusive access to their services. The most accomplished prostitutes were often those who could transcend the purely sexual dimensions of their work and establish themselves as entertainers, confidants, or even informal advisors to powerful men. These women might gain access to political intelligence, business prospects, or social connections that could be leveraged for personal advancement. However, such success was uncommon and frequently transient, contingent upon maintaining the favor of capricious and influential men. The offspring of prostitutes confronted particular challenges in medieval society. They were often stigmatized by their mother's profession and had limited opportunities for social mobility. Boys might be apprenticed to trades or enlisted into military service, while girls frequently followed their mothers into prostitution or other forms of service work. The cycle of poverty and social marginalization proved difficult to break. The relationship between prostitution and other forms of criminality was complex. Prostitutes might serve as informants for thieves and other criminals, utilizing their intimate connections with customers to gather information regarding their wealth, routines, and vulnerabilities. They might also become victims of crime, targeted by robbers who assumed they carried substantial sums of cash, or by criminals who perceived them as easy targets unlikely to receive protection from authorities. The seasonal patterns of prostitution in medieval taverns mirrored broader economic and social cycles. Business was often more robust during harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days, when men had more disposable income and greater reasons to celebrate. Military campaigns, trade expeditions, and other events that brought large contingents of men to an area could stimulate temporary surges in demand for sexual services. The geographical distribution of prostitution also varied considerably. Urban establishments in prominent cities could host a multitude of prostitutes operating in relative security and prosperity, whereas rural venues might only feature one or two women working under more perilous and isolated conditions. Port cities and significant trade routes proved especially profitable locations due to their attraction of numerous travelers with disposable income. The regulation of prostitution by religious and secular authorities frequently exhibited contradictions and hypocrisy. The very officials who publicly condemned prostitution might privately frequent prostitutes, or financially gain from their activities through taxation or graft. Yet, despite its assault on the senses, there was an undeniable vibrancy about a medieval tavern. The very air seemed to pulsate with energy, with the raw vitality of people living life at its most fundamental level. This was humanity stripped of pretense, reduced to its essential components: the need for sustenance, drink, companionship, and the occasional violent outburst. It was uncomfortable. It was perilous. But it was never, ever dull. And as your eyes adjusted to the dim light and your lungs adapted to the thick air, you began to discern the figures that populated this smoky underworld. Merchants discreetly counting coins with suspicious glances. Soldiers still caked with the mud of distant battlefields. Pilgrims seeking sanctuary en route to sacred sites. Artisans celebrating the completion of a challenging commission. And locals who seemed to have emerged directly from the very floorboards. So perfectly did they blend with their surroundings. Each face recounted a story, and most of those stories were etched in scars, missing teeth, and eyes that had witnessed too much. These were not the idealized peasants of romantic literature, but real people living authentic lives in an era when survival was perpetually uncertain, and comfort was a rare luxury. They wore their hardships like badges of honor, and their laughter, when it occurred, possessed the sharp edge of those who understood that tomorrow might bring only sorrow. The tavern keeper, typically a portly individual of questionable integrity, presided over this disorder like a monarch over his court. The church might preach against sexual immorality while tolerating, or even profiting from, brothels situated on church property. The influence of prostitution on medieval society extended considerably beyond the individuals directly involved. It impacted marriage customs, family structures, and social relationships in ways that were often subtle yet substantial. The availability of commercial sex might lessen the pressure on unmarried women to engage in premarital sex, but it could also diminish men's motivations to marry and establish families. The economic ramifications of prostitution were also noteworthy. It represented a significant clandestine economy that generated income for women, tavern owners, and various intermediaries, while simultaneously creating demand for an array of goods and services, from apparel and cosmetics to sustenance and lodging. The money expended on prostitution might otherwise have been saved or allocated to other goods and services, affecting the wider economy in intricate ways. The cultural impact of prostitution was perhaps the most profound of all. It challenged conventional notions of female virtue and male honor while simultaneously reinforcing them. It provided an outlet for sexual desires that might otherwise have been expressed in more socially disruptive manners. However, it also created a class of women who were permanently marginalized and stigmatized. The narratives of individual prostitutes who worked in medieval taverns are largely lost to history. Their voices silenced by illiteracy, social stigma, and the general tendency of historical records to overlook the experiences of marginalized individuals. Yet, their presence in these establishments served as a constant reminder of the harsh realities of medieval life and the limited options available to women who found themselves outside the protection of family, marriage, or religious institutions. Justice in medieval taverns was a complex and often contradictory affair where official law enforcement vied with unofficial systems of order, and the demarcation between legal authority and criminal enterprise was often indistinguishable. The tavern existed in a legal gray area, simultaneously subject to royal authority, church jurisdiction, guild regulations, and local customs that might fundamentally contradict each other. The most visible representatives of official law enforcement were the constables, bailiffs, and other officers tasked with maintaining order in their jurisdictions. These individuals were often part-time officials who combined law enforcement duties with other occupations, and their effectiveness varied widely based on their personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. A strong, well-connected constable might be able to maintain order in even the most unruly tavern, while a weak or corrupt official might find himself disregarded or even physically menaced by the very people he was meant to control. The powers of these officials were extensive in theory, but constrained in practice. They could apprehend suspected criminals, confiscate property, and impose fines for various offenses, but their ability to enforce these powers depended on their personal authority and the support of the local community. A constable attempting to arrest a popular local figure might face a hostile crowd, while one targeting unpopular outsiders might receive enthusiastic support from tavern patrons. The crimes that law enforcement officials were most concerned with in taverns were those that threatened public order or royal authority. Treason, sedition, and other political crimes were treated with great seriousness, as were violent crimes resulting in severe injury or death. Property crimes like theft and fraud were also prosecuted, though the effectiveness of enforcement varied widely based on the value of the stolen goods and the social status of the victims. However, many activities that would be considered criminal today were either legal or tolerated in medieval taverns. Gambling was officially prohibited in many jurisdictions, but widely practiced and rarely prosecuted. Prostitution might be regulated rather than banned, with officials more concerned about taxation and health issues than moral considerations. Even violence might be overlooked if it was perceived as a legitimate response to provocation, or if the participants were willing to resolve their differences privately. The church possessed its own system of law enforcement that operated in parallel to secular authorities. Canon law governed many aspects of medieval life, including marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance, and church officials had the authority to investigate and punish violations of these laws. Taverns were particular targets of church enforcement because they were associated with many activities the church considered sinful: drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. Church officials might conduct raids on taverns, arresting customers for various moral offenses and imposing penances or fines as punishment. They might also pressure secular authorities to close establishments deemed particularly problematic, or to impose stricter regulations on tavern operations. Yet, the church's enforcement efforts were often hampered by the same practical limitations that affected secular authorities: limited resources, competing priorities, and the difficulty of altering deeply ingrained social behaviors. The guild system provided another layer of law enforcement that influenced tavern operations. Guilds possessed the authority to regulate their members' business practices, set prices and quality standards, and penalize violations of guild rules. Tavern keepers who were guild members might find themselves subject to guild discipline for various offenses, while those operating outside the guild system might face harassment or boycotts organized by guild members. The most effective form of law enforcement in medieval taverns was often the informal system of social control exercised by the tavern keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper could maintain order through a combination of personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives. Meanwhile, regular customers might police each other's behavior to shield their favorite establishment from official interference. This informal system of justice operated according to its own rules and procedures, which might bear little resemblance to official legal processes. Disputes might be resolved through negotiation, compensation, or ritualized combat, with the tavern keeper serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Punishments might range from public humiliation and temporary banishment to physical violence and even death, depending on the severity of the offense and the preferences of those in authority. The relationship between official and unofficial law enforcement was intricate and often symbiotic. Official authorities might rely on tavern keepers to maintain order and report serious crimes, while tavern keepers might summon official authorities when confronted with problems they could not handle themselves. However, this cooperation was always fragile and could rapidly disintegrate if the interests of the two systems came into conflict. Corruption was endemic in medieval law enforcement, and taverns were both a source and a target of corrupt practices. Officials might accept bribes to overlook illegal activities, participate in the profits of criminal enterprises, or use their authority to extort money from tavern keepers and customers. Tavern keepers might pay protection money to avoid harassment, provide free food and drink to curry favor with officials, or offer sexual services as a form of payment. The most corrupt officials were those who utilized their positions to engage in criminal activities themselves. A constable might organize theft rings, a bailiff might administer illegal gambling operations, or a church official might profit from prostitution while publicly condemning it. These officials were often more dangerous than ordinary criminals because they possessed legal authority to conceal their crimes and punish those who opposed them. The legal procedures employed to prosecute crimes in medieval taverns were often crude and unreliable by modern standards. Evidence might consist of little more than witness testimony, which could be influenced by personal relationships, financial incentives, or simple fear. Physical evidence was rarely systematically collected or preserved, and the concept of forensic investigation was virtually unknown. Trials were often public spectacles that served as much to entertain the community as to ascertain guilt or innocence. The accused might be required to undergo various forms of ordeal: trial by combat, trial by fire, or trial by water, that were believed to reveal divine judgment about their guilt or innocence. These procedures were based on religious beliefs rather than rational investigation, and their outcomes were often determined more by chance than by actual guilt or innocence. The punishments imposed for crimes committed in medieval taverns were designed to serve multiple purposes: deterrence, retribution, and public entertainment. Public executions, floggings, and other types of corporal punishment were commonplace, frequently conducted in market squares or other communal areas where large throngs could gather to witness. These public displays served to bolster societal hierarchies and moral boundaries, while simultaneously furnishing entertainment for the populace. Nevertheless, punishment was also highly inconsistent and often arbitrary. The identical offense might lead to a minor fine for an affluent merchant and execution for an impoverished peasant, contingent on the offender's social standing, the prevailing political climate, and the personal inclinations of the judge. Justice in medieval times was not impartial. It was acutely cognizant of social distinctions and power dynamics. The efficacy of law enforcement in medieval taverns was constrained by numerous practical impediments. Communication was sluggish and unreliable, complicating the coordination of enforcement efforts across different jurisdictions. Transportation was costly and perilous, impeding officials' capacity to swiftly address issues in remote regions. Record-keeping was rudimentary, making it arduous to track habitual offenders or identify recurring criminal patterns. Societal attitudes toward law enforcement were also intricate and frequently contradictory. While individuals generally endorsed the notion of upholding order and punishing criminals, they often harbored suspicions of official authority and resented intrusion into their daily routines. A tavern patron might applaud the apprehension of a thief who had pilfered his purse, but vehemently object to the enforcement of laws against gambling or drinking. The economic incentives surrounding law enforcement were frequently perverse. Officials were often remunerated through fees and fines rather than regular wages, fostering motivations to apprehend and prosecute individuals irrespective of their actual culpability. Tavern proprietors might discover it more economical to offer bribes than to adhere to regulations, while customers might prefer to resolve conflicts privately rather than involve official authorities who might impose additional expenses and complications. The geographical distribution of law enforcement resources was highly disparate. Major metropolises might possess relatively sophisticated law enforcement systems with numerous officials, established protocols, and regular patrols, whereas rural areas might have only a single part-time constable responsible for scores of villages and hundreds of square miles. Taverns in secluded areas might operate with virtual impunity, while those in major cities might confront constant scrutiny and harassment. The seasonal patterns of law enforcement mirrored broader social and economic cycles. Officials might be more active during harvest festivals and other periods when large crowds convened and tensions were heightened, while enforcement might be relaxed during winter months when travel was arduous and criminal activity was diminished. Military campaigns and other significant events might divert law enforcement resources from routine duties, creating opportunities for escalated criminal activity. The long-term effectiveness of medieval law enforcement in taverns is challenging to ascertain, but it appears evident that it was only partially successful in achieving its stated objectives. Crime persistently posed a significant problem throughout the medieval era, and taverns remained hubs of illicit and semi-legal activity, despite repeated attempts to regulate them. Nevertheless, law enforcement did fulfill crucial social functions, furnishing a mechanism for dispute resolution, maintaining social hierarchies, and reinforcing moral boundaries even when it failed to entirely eradicate criminal behavior. As dawn broke over the medieval world, painting the sky in hues of gray and gold, the taverns that had pulsated with life throughout the night began their gradual transformation back to something resembling respectability. Yet the remnants of the previous evening's activities lingered like smoke in the rafters, bloodstains on the floor, shattered furniture in the corners, and the hollow-eyed gazes of those who had gambled away their futures on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. The morning after was when the true cost of tavern life became apparent. Bodies had to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others permanently silenced by violence. Debts had to be collected or forgiven, depending on the debtor's capacity to pay and the creditor's capacity for mercy. Reputations had to be rebuilt or relinquished as news of the night's events spread through the community like ripples on a pond. For the tavern keeper, morning brought the grim arithmetic of profit and loss. How much had been earned from food, drink, and other services? How much had been lost to theft, damage, and unpaid bills? How many customers had been gained or lost based on the previous night's events? The successful tavern keeper was one who could balance these competing factors while preserving the delicate ecosystem that made his establishment profitable. The cleanup process was both physical and social. Floors had to be swept, furniture repaired, and supplies replenished. But more significantly, relationships had to be mended, alliances renegotiated, and the intricate web of obligations and expectations that held the tavern community together had to be rewoven. A dispute between two regular patrons might necessitate weeks of meticulous diplomacy to resolve, while a single act of treachery could dismantle years of carefully cultivated trust. The women who toiled in the tavern, whether as servers, cooks, or prostitutes, confronted their own distinct challenges in the morning light. Bruises had to be concealed, torn clothing mended, and the psychological wounds of the previous night's encounters somehow processed and compartmentalized. For many of these women, each new day presented the same choice: continue in a life that offered little prospect of betterment, or risk everything on an uncertain alternative. The customers who had survived the night faced their own reckonings. Merchants had to evaluate whether their business dealings had been profitable or disastrous. Soldiers had to determine whether their reputations had been enhanced or diminished by their actions. Craftsmen had to return to their workshops and endeavor to concentrate on their trades despite hangovers, injuries, and the lingering effects of whatever substances they had consumed. But perhaps the most profound reckoning was the one that transpired within the minds and souls of those who had participated in tavern life. In the harsh light of day, actions that had seemed reasonable or even heroic in the flickering candlelight of the tavern might appear sordid or shameful. Promises made in the heat of passion or the haze of drink might prove impossible to fulfill. Alliances forged in the crucible of shared danger might crumble under the weight of sober reflection. The church, which had officially condemned tavern culture while often participating in it unofficially, offered its own form of reckoning through the sacrament of confession. Priests who had themselves been tavern patrons the night before might find themselves hearing confessions from fellow customers, creating an intricate web of shared guilt and mutual absolution. The distinction between sin and necessity, between moral failing and survival strategy, was often too blurred to clearly differentiate. The legal system furnished another form of reckoning, though one that was often delayed and unpredictable. Crimes committed in the heat of the moment might not be prosecuted for weeks or months, if at all. Witnesses might vanish, evidence might be destroyed, and the political climate might shift in ways that impacted the likelihood of prosecution. Justice, when it arrived, might bear little resemblance to what modern observers would consider fair or appropriate. The economic reckoning was perhaps the most immediate and tangible. Debts incurred during a night of gambling or drinking had to be settled, often with interest and penalties that could rapidly spiral out of control. Property lost in wagers had to be surrendered, sometimes including items that were vital for the loser's livelihood. Families might find themselves impoverished by a single night's poor decisions, while others might discover unexpected windfalls that could dramatically alter their circumstances. The social reckoning was more subtle but equally significant. Reputations painstakingly built over years could be shattered in a single evening, while others might be enhanced by displays of courage, generosity, or skill. Marriage prospects might be improved or ruined based on behavior in the tavern, and business relationships might be strengthened or severed based on perceived loyalty or betrayal. The psychological reckoning was perhaps the most intricate of all. The medieval mind was not equipped with modern concepts of trauma, addiction, or mental health. But the effects of tavern life on the human psyche were nonetheless real and substantial. The constant exposure to violence, the pressure to uphold social standing through demonstrations of aggression or recklessness, and the use of alcohol and other substances to cope with the harsh realities of medieval life, all exacted their toll on mental and emotional well-being. For some, the tavern represented a form of escape from the grinding poverty, social oppression, and limited opportunities that characterized medieval life for the majority of the population. It offered a space where normal social rules were suspended, where a peasant might drink with a nobleman, where a woman might wield power and influence, where luck and skill could triumph over birth and breeding. But this escape came at a cost that many were unable or unwilling to bear. The cycle of tavern life was relentless and self-perpetuating. Each night brought new customers seeking the identical things that had drawn their predecessors: food, drink, companionship, excitement, and the possibility of altering their circumstances through luck or skill. Each morning brought similar reflections, identical efforts to grasp past events and brace for the future. A tavern keeper who thrived understood this pattern, learning to work with it rather than against it. He supplied his patrons' needs while safeguarding himself from the harshest outcomes of their actions. He maintained order without stifling the vibrancy that made his establishment lucrative. He navigated the conflicting demands of law enforcement, religious authorities, guild regulations, and customer expectations, all while somehow generating profit. Yet, even the most successful tavern keeper lived aware that his prosperity rested on human frailty and desperation. The profits that afforded him comfort stemmed from others' losses: the gamblers who couldn't quit, the drinkers who couldn't stop, the lonely souls who paid for companionship elusive elsewhere. This realization might trouble his conscience, or perhaps it was simply accepted as the natural order in a world where survival often demanded moral compromises. The broader society that encompassed and supported tavern culture was equally entangled in its own contradictions. The very authorities who denounced taverns as dens of vice also relied on them for tax revenue, intelligence gathering, and social control. The same church that preached against the sins associated with tavern life also benefited from the donations of tavern keepers and the confessions of their patrons. The same communities that ostracized tavern workers also depended on the services they rendered. This hypocrisy was not lost on those who inhabited and worked in the tavern world. They understood that they fulfilled vital social functions while simultaneously being condemned for it. They offered outlets for human needs and desires that lacked other acceptable expression in medieval society. They created environments where social tensions could dissipate before escalating into more destructive manifestations. They provided avenues for social mobility and economic advancement unavailable through conventional channels. The enduring impact of medieval tavern culture extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The institutions, practices, and social interactions that blossomed in these establishments influenced the evolution of modern hospitality industries, entertainment venues, and social spaces. The tensions between regulation and liberty, morality and necessity, order and chaos that defined medieval taverns continue to shape discussions regarding social policy and individual freedom today. But perhaps the most significant legacy of medieval tavern culture is the reminder it offers about the intricate and contradictory nature of humanity. The same individuals capable of great cruelty and selfishness within the tavern environment were also capable of profound kindness and generosity. The same institutions that facilitated crime and vice also provided community and support for those with nowhere else to turn. The same social dynamics that generated conflict and violence also forged bonds of loyalty and friendship that could endure a lifetime. The medieval tavern functioned as a mirror, reflecting both the finest and worst aspects of human society. It was a place where the veneer of civilization was peeled away, revealing raw humanity beneath, with all its beauty and ugliness, its nobility and baseness, its capacity for both creation and destruction. By studying these institutions, we gain insights not just into medieval history, but into ourselves and the perennial human struggle to reconcile individual desires with societal needs, personal freedom with collective responsibility, and the pursuit of happiness with the demands of survival. As the sun set on the medieval world and rose on the modern age, the taverns that had served as crucibles of human experience gradually transformed into new forms. Yet the fundamental human needs they had satisfied, for food, drink, companionship, excitement, and the potential for transformation remained constant. His word was law within these confines, and his justice was swift and often brutal. He knew every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and their vulnerabilities. He was part confessor, part loan shark, and part executioner, depending on the demands of the situation. His wife, if he had one, was often equally formidable, wielding a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the dexterity of a seasoned warrior and the authority of a judge. This was the world you entered when you pushed through that heavy wooden door. A world where society's normal rules were suspended, where anything could transpire, and where the only constant was uncertainty itself. It was a place that could offer you the best night of your life or the last night of your life, sometimes simultaneously. And as you stood there absorbing this sensory onslaught, you realized that you had crossed more than just a threshold. You had stepped into an entirely different realm, one governed by its own laws, its own customs, and its own unique brand of justice. Whether you would emerge unscathed depended entirely on your wit, your fortune, and your capacity to navigate the treacherous social currents that flowed through every medieval tavern like a subterranean river. Not all medieval drinking establishments were created equal, and grasping the subtle but crucial distinctions between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse could mean the difference between a restful night's sleep and waking up in a ditch with your purse missing and your head throbbing like a church bell. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the inns, the aristocrats of the hospitality sector. These establishments were primarily designed to accommodate travelers, offering not merely food and drink, but actual beds, or at least something that more closely resembled a bed than a pile of straw. The more sophisticated inns were substantial structures, often built with stone as opposed to the more prevalent timber and daub, featuring multiple levels and chambers capable of housing merchants, pilgrims, and other voyagers who possessed both the means and the necessity for overnight lodging. The Tabard in Southwark, famously immortalized by Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales, stood as a prime example of such an establishment. Here, according to Chaucer's narrative, travelers could anticipate discovering provisions of the utmost quality, alongside wine that was both potent and delightful. The settings might differ, the technologies more advanced, the social structures more intricate, but the basic dynamics of human interaction in spaces dedicated to pleasure and profit continued to unfold in ways that would have been recognizable to any medieval tavern keeper. The raw truth about medieval taverns was their simultaneous position as both the best and worst of their era. They were places of genuine community and brutal exploitation, of authentic human connection and calculated manipulation, of liberation from social constraints and enslavement to human weakness. They were institutions that showcased the full spectrum of human possibility, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the heroic to the criminal, from the sacred to the profane. Ultimately, the medieval tavern stands as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of human society. Despite all the perils, contradictions, and moral compromises involved, these institutions endured and flourished because they fulfilled real human needs in ways that no other social institution could rival. They offered spaces where people could be fully human, with all the messiness, complexity, and contradiction that entails. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to influence how we conceptualize community, hospitality, and the eternal human quest for meaning and connection in an often hostile and unpredictable world. The tavern door creaks shut one final time. The fire dwindles to embers, and the last patron stumbles out into the dawn. But the narratives persist, passed down through generations, reminding us that in every epoch, in every society, there are places where the human drama unfolds in all its raw intensity. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit endures wherever people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience of being alive in a world that is both beautiful and terrible, promising and threatening, filled with both hope and despair. And perhaps that is the ultimate revelation about medieval taverns. Not that they were merely dens of iniquity or centers of community, but that they were profoundly human institutions that mirrored the full complexity of the human condition. They were places where people came to be themselves, for better or worse, and in doing so, they forged a legacy that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever sought refuge from the world in the company of strangers, who, for a brief moment, might become friends. The host was portrayed as an individual of considerable standing, one who derived pride from his establishment and his capacity to cater to the requirements of his guests. This represented hospitality as a vocation, rather than merely a channel for dispensing surplus ale. However, even the most distinguished inns harbored certain quirks that would astonish contemporary sensibilities. Opacity, as we comprehend it today, was simply non-existent. Travelers were routinely crammed into rooms akin to cargo, with 10 or 12 strangers sharing not only the same space, but frequently the same bed. The notion of solitary accommodation was reserved for the exceedingly affluent, and even then, it was more a matter of prestige than comfort. The beds themselves were wonders of medieval ingenuity and resilience. Constructed from rope or leather straps stretched across wooden frameworks, they supported mattresses filled with straw, feathers, or whatever natural material was both available and affordable. These mattresses were seldom changed and never cleansed in any meaningful sense. They served as habitats for entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other organisms that regarded human guests as nothing more than a convenient food source. Sharing a bed with strangers was not merely uncomfortable but potentially hazardous. Theft was commonplace, as was aggression arising from disagreements over space, snoring, or the various biological functions humans perform during sleep. Many travelers learned to slumber with one eye open, their most valuable possessions clutched firmly to their chests. The cuisine at inns was generally superior to what one might encounter elsewhere, but this was a relative assessment. The finest inns might offer roasted meats, fresh bread, and ale brewed within the preceding days. The less reputable ones might serve something that had once been an animal, accompanied by bread that could serve as a weapon and ale that tasted suspiciously as if it had been filtered through a horse. Taverns occupied the intermediate position within medieval hospitality. Initially, these establishments were the domain of vintners, wine merchants who retailed their products directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and exuded an aura of sophistication that ale could never rival. A gallon of respectable red wine from Gascony might cost 3 pennies, double the price of the finest ale, while Rhenish wine could command 6 to 8 pennies per gallon. The wine trade was rigorously regulated, and for valid reasons. Adulteration was prevalent, with unprincipled tavern keepers diluting their wine, blending it with cheaper alternatives, or even fabricating entirely counterfeit versions using whatever ingredients they could procure. The penalties for such deception were severe and publicly enforced. A tavern keeper apprehended selling adulterated wine might find himself confined in the pillory with the offending liquid poured over his head, a form of punishment that blended public humiliation with poetic justice. To counter fraud, customers possessed the right to inspect the wine they were purchasing. A discerning patron could demand to be escorted to the cellar to examine the actual barrel from which his wine was being drawn. This practice led to the evolution of intricate cellars beneath many taverns, cool subterranean chambers where barrels of wine matured, and where more discerning customers could authenticate their purchase. Wine criers, officials whose duty it was to inspect and announce the quality and price of wine available in local taverns, roamed the streets, broadcasting their findings. These individuals, often also serving as town criers, would extol the virtues of wine obtainable at 4 farthings or caution against establishments where the quality was questionable. Their announcements served as both advertisement and consumer protection, assisting customers in making informed decisions about where to spend their hard-earned currency. As taverns evolved, they began to broaden their offerings beyond wine. Cider crafted from apples, perry from pears, and mead concocted from honey all made their way onto tavern tables. Some establishments also started providing food, recognizing that hungry customers were thirsty customers, and that an individual with food in their stomach was more inclined to linger and continue imbibing. The transformation of taverns from mere wine shops to full-service establishments was gradual but inevitable. As their profits from food and drink escalated, many tavern keepers began offering rooms for rent, blurring the distinctions between taverns and inns. These rooms were typically small, cramped spaces on the upper floors of the edifice, often accommodating multiple strangers who had never met before and might never meet again. At the lowest tier of the hospitality hierarchy were the alehouses, unpretentious establishments that originated as private residences where the housewife brewed more ale than her family could consume. These women, known as alewives, would signal the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom outside their door, a simple yet effective form of medieval advertising. Ale constituted the lifeblood of medieval society, consumed by everyone from infants to the elderly because it was frequently safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, eradicated many of the harmful bacteria that rendered untreated water dangerous to drink. A typical alewife might brew several times a week, producing ale that would only last a few days before turning sour or developing off flavors. The quality of ale varied significantly from house to house and batch to batch. Some alewives prided themselves on their craft, producing ale that was clear, flavorful, and properly fermented. Others were less meticulous, selling ale that was weak, sour, or contaminated with whatever ingredients they had used to extend their grain supplies. Breadcrumbs, herbs, and even less palatable additives might find their way into a batch of ale, either by chance or by design. Despite their humble beginnings, alehouses were subjected to strict regulation. The Assize of Bread and Ale enacted in 1266 linked the price of ale to the price of wheat and established quality standards that all brewers were expected to uphold. Alicaners, sworn officials whose responsibility it was to test ale and guarantee its quality, made regular rounds of alehouses, sampling the wares and ensuring that customers were receiving what they paid for. The punishments for brewing inferior ale or charging exorbitant prices were severe and public. Male brewers who infringed upon the assize might find themselves incarcerated in the pillory, while female brewers faced the trebuchet, not the massive siege engine, but a smaller device designed to repeatedly dunk the offender in the nearest body of water. These punishments served as both a deterrent and entertainment, attracting crowds who relished witnessing the downfall of those who had attempted to defraud their neighbors. But alehouses offered more than just beverages. They were social hubs where news was disseminated, gossip was exchanged, and commerce was conducted. A successful alewife might find herself at the nexus of her community's social network, privy to secrets and scandals that could make or break reputations. She was part bartender, part therapist, and part intelligence broker roles that demanded discretion, wisdom, and resilience. The ambiance in an alehouse was typically more relaxed than in a tavern or inn. These were neighborhood establishments where everyone knew everyone else, where credit might be extended to trusted customers, and where disputes were more likely to be resolved with words than with weapons. However, even alehouses had their perils, and a stranger entering such an establishment might find himself the object of intense scrutiny and suspicion. Understanding these distinctions was paramount for any medieval traveler. Choosing the wrong establishment could lead to paying in prices for alehouse quality, or worse, sleeping in a ditch because suitable accommodations were not as readily available as presumed. The sagacious traveler learned to interpret the signs, both literally and figuratively, that indicated the nature of the establishment he was entering and what he could anticipate finding there. In a world where water could kill one faster than one's adversaries, alcohol was not merely a luxury, it was a necessity. The medieval relationship with drink differed fundamentally from our contemporary understanding, shaped by practical considerations that rendered sobriety not only unpleasant but potentially lethal. Water, the most fundamental of human requirements, was frequently the most perilous substance one could consume.